So, thank you everybody for making the time today. I think this is a really special event for us. It's the first actually that we're holding as SAMED, which is a bit of a shame considering that we've actually had our code for I think more than 20 years. And we've had a number of complaints where we have actually convened an ethics panel in the past. So I think this just shows that we are really taking this very seriously, and we want to make sure that the people who are on our ethics panelist are adequately trained and equipped to deal with the nuances and the seriousness of what is required of them. So just to please be aware that the meeting is being recorded. By participating, you consent to the recording thereof, and also a reminder of our competition law requirements that we're not here to collude or contravene competition law. And if you have a conflict of interest or one becomes apparent during the session, please raise it, declare it at the when required. Next slide, please, Caroline. Thank you. So we have quite a full agenda today. What I'd like to do in terms of format is allow myself and Michael to finish our presentations, and then we want to leave a lot of time for questions, because that's how people learn. It's through asking questions, and we learn from you too. So that's how we're going to run today's session. Next slide.
Tan, could I interrupt you? Before we go to the first slide, could everybody just come on with a camera so that we can see everybody and see that everybody's real and that nobody's got a puppet there and they're fast asleep?
Awesome. Now we'll see if people are on the beach.
Good morning, Michael, and you must be very happy with the way things are proceeding with your team.
I'm actually talking to you from a cloud on which I'm floating.
Well done, well done. Long may it last.
I'm considering moving from an Arsenal t-shirt to having a tattoo on my forehead which says I support Arsenal.
Well done. Morning.
Morning.
Morning, everybody.
Lovely
Morning,
to see
everybody.
you, Robbie.
Great. So if you can move on to the next slide, please, Caroline. So all of you, and the next one, all of you know who I am. So I'm going to just introduce Michael to you, and I'm actually going to ask Michael to talk a little bit about himself. Michael and I have known each other now, goodness me.
Since Nas Burta was playing in the under-12 rugby team.
But I'll tell you how I did meet Michael. It was actually not via a SAMED member. I had a call from a very lovely lady who worked, or I'm not sure if she's still there, for a company called Galderma. And she asked me to come and meet with her to discuss a case, a court case that they were embroiled in with the then MCC. And it was about a product that the MCC had actually locked away and wasn't allowing it to be released from Port Health because they felt that this product was a medicine, and Galderma felt that this product was a medical device. And if you recall, at the time, we didn't have medical device regulations. And in fact, this product was a combination medical device, and MCC was insisting that it be registered as a medicine. While Michael was the legal counsel in that case. And suffice to say that through Michael's expertise, Galderma won the case, and the product was declared a medical device, and the product was released. And that was how I met Michael, and we've had a wonderful relationship since then. I think both personally, if I may say so, Michael, but also from a business perspective. Michael has worked with SAMED now for many years, not just as our independent chair of the code enforcement process and the whistleblowing hotline, but also he has guided SAMED on many matters, especially around good governance. He has trained our board in terms of what it means to be a good member of a board, and what your roles and responsibilities are. And very, very happy to have you here, Mike. You've helped us with our constitution, and just in many areas, and great wisdom, wonderful guidance. Have loved working with you, and very happy that you're here today to give us your input on this very important topic. So I'm going to let you maybe just say a few words about yourself.
So just thank you, Tan, for those kind words, which I know you mean sincerely. Just going back to the Galderma case, two observations. The first is that I knew little about devices when I was briefed, and I think I knew a lot about devices, and all of it I learned from you, Tanya. So thank you for the learning and for the teaching, which has stood me in such good stead all these years. The second thing is the product was a face filler, and I had to learn all about the product, how it worked, all the intricacies. I was taught by the Galderma internal people and by other experts, and the one lasting thing which I never know to be happy or unhappy about is when I walk into a coffee shop and I look around, I can tell you every woman that's had her face filled and every one that hasn't. So, but it's been an incredible experience working with SAMED. I've learned so much from the wonderful people. Tan, you've been a wonderful teacher, and not because he's on the call, but I've learned so much from Rob, who's so wise and understands the industry so well and has been so generous with his time. And I also would like just to recognize my assistant, Michelle, if she can just put on her camera for a moment. Michelle started at our office as a receptionist because her father couldn't find a job for her, and has grown into being one of the most outstanding, smartest young lawyers I've ever worked with, and is now where we work together, and very often teacher and pupil roles are now swapped, and Michelle often is teaching me. She also knows every few minutes she hears from our office, Michelle, and the scream means that I've got some digital problem that I can't solve, and she comes in and sorts it out for me. So lovely to be with you, Michelle, and to have worked with you all these years. So thank you very much, and I'm really looking forward to today, to the chat. And as you said, Tan, I know for myself, all through the years of being a commercial lawyer and the work that I've done on the King, all the King reports, I've learned the best from the people that you chat to, from the questions that are asked. So please, guys, lots of questions, and we'll get through the slides as quickly as we can. I think that's about all, Tan. Sometimes I think the only person in the world that likes me is my late mom, but being a lawyer. But I'm happy to be here today and just conclude. You know what I always tell you, every Jewish mother wants their son to be an accountant or a doctor, and if he's a little bit retarded, a lawyer, and that's why I'm a lawyer.
Thanks, Michael. And also just to recognize Michelle, who supports Michael and has been incredibly supportive of me and the code committee and often when we review the code. So thank you, Michelle. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to briefly go through a little bit about what we expect of the panelists, and so will Michael, but let me start with mine. So a really fundamental requirement of a panelist on our ethics committee is that you must be familiar with and well-versed in applicable legislation. And some legislation governs the medtech industry directly, but there are others that you should be aware of that might not explicitly, but are nevertheless relevant. So you will all get a copy of this slide deck, and I've listed between Michael and I the legislation, regulations, and even when it comes to the Health Professions Council of South Africa, some booklets that are relevant when you consider a case, when you deal with the code. So although the code does not talk to, it's not there to implement the law, and the ethics panelists, if there is a case that is in relation to the law or to a regulation, you would not determine that case, you would pass it on to the relevant authority. But these legislation and regulations are pertinent. You need to understand the legislative framework. And so please, if you don't know these laws or regulations, you do need to go away from today and read through them. And if you have any questions around them, to please reach out to the SAMED office, and we will attempt to support you in that. Also very important is that, you know, many of the SAMED members are multinationals or distributors. In fact, the majority of our members are distributors, which means they are distributing product on behalf of another international manufacturer that is based elsewhere. And there are some international laws and codes that have bearing on South Africa. So, for example, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act or the UK Anti-Bribery Act or the Sunshine Act, these have a very far reach. And you may, as a distributor, have to actually abide by these international laws and codes. So it's also important that you as a panelist are aware of these codes and laws. Next slide, please, Caroline. Another important part of your education is around what has gone before. So what judgments, what case law, local and international, pertain to the kinds of activities that companies participate in, that the code deals with. And certainly, you know, I'm not pointing to any particular SAMED member company. That's not the purpose. You'll see some names there of member companies that are based here. But very interesting, most of the case law we do find is coming from, in particular, the states. And that's really because they have a very active Department of Justice. And they are very keen on scrutinizing both the pharmaceutical and the medtech industry and their relationships with their customers, be they surgeons or nurses, or hospital groups. So it's really important that you get a sense of what has happened in other parts of the world, what have other companies have had, what have they grappled with, what have been the sanctions that have been applied to parties, whether it's both the surgeons and the actual companies themselves. And this will help you in your deliberation as an ethics panelist. Also, we have our code advisory opinions. You probably know that SAMED provides this as a service to any party, members, healthcare professionals. We give non-binding, non-legal advisory opinions. And we have summarized these, and these are published on the SAMED website, and we urge you to go through those as well. We also have a summary of the cases, hotline cases and code complaints that have gone before, and request that you also review these. These are all links, and you can get these from us when we send you the slides. Next one. So just in terms of the code and where an ethics panelist is dealt with. This is primarily in part 2 of the code. So this, obviously you should read the entire code, but when it pertains to your role as a panelist, part 2 is really the section that you need to heed. If you can pass, next slide, please, Caroline. And some tips as a panelist. It's really important that the code is not going to cover absolutely every single activity that happens out there in the marketplace. The code is, it contains a number of principles, it contains guidelines, and you now need to interpret those as a panelist, and you need to apply them to the activity that you are faced with in terms of a potential complaint. So there are some principles that you need to heed when you are deliberating on a complaint and also when you're considering the sanctions. And these principles are in the code. They're the principle of image and perception. So what would this activity look like to a layperson? If it was broadcast out there to the general public, what image and perception would the public have of this company, of this activity, of the medtech industry, in fact? And so if that image and perception is a negative one, well, more than likely the activity is not in accordance with the code. The principle of separation. Are there enough China walls in place to actually prevent the possibility of inducement or, you know, bribery and perversity in terms of the engagement between the company and the customer or the healthcare professional? An example of this is the prohibition of direct sponsorship. Previously, companies were allowed to directly sponsor, they were allowed to directly contact healthcare professionals and offer sponsorship. So there wasn't that sufficient separation in terms of that activity. And we have now created that separation through indirect sponsorship, where you now would go via the Healthcare Professionals Society, and they in turn will identify who the recipient of a grant should be. Principle of transparency. Any engagements or interactions or contracts that you have should be available. They should be transparent. You shouldn't feel awkward necessarily about the activity. Principle of equivalence. This is about fair market value. It's about making sure that the service or the contract or the engagement with a customer, and if you're paying a fee towards that, the fee is equivalent to the actual service that was provided and is not an inducement. And the principle of documentation. So as a panelist, you know, you're going to be asking these kinds of questions in terms of a complaint. Does this activity abide by these principles? Is there sufficient documentation that is transparent, that shows that the activity was all above board? Next slide. Also, what is the intent? This is a very important question to ask. You know, what was the actual intent behind the activity? Was it really to promote a product, to promote the company? Was it around training, or was it potentially an incentive or a bribe? Because very often activities that appear to be very at face value appear to be one thing. Actually, when you look at the intent behind it, can become an incentive or a bribe. And was the activity ensuring that the patient is always at the heart of the matter and that the healthcare professional's independent clinical judgment was upheld? So these are the kinds of questions that you should be asking when you adjudicate a complaint. Next slide. Just to bear in mind that there are two ways in which complaints are handled in terms of the medical device code. One is the whistleblowing hotline, and the next one, Caroline, is a formal written complaint. So Michael is the independent chair of both types of complaints. Michael receives the hotline reports and reviews them as the independent chair. He would also receive a formal written complaint if there was one submitted to SAMED. In both instances, an ethics panel can be called by Michael to review either a hotline code complaint or even a formal written complaint. Next slide. So the independent chair, who is Michael at this point, is appointed by the board. It is a legal expert who has experience in this field and has various powers in terms of dealing with code complaints. And one of those powers is that a hearing be held before an ethics panel, which is constituted by the independent chair. So SAMED has a pool of ethics panelists, and if Michael decides that this case requires that a hearing be held before an ethics panel, then Michael will review the panelist list and will appoint 2 persons from that list. We are busy with a code review at the moment, and in fact, Michael has proposed some amendments to the code, in particular that we actually have more than 2 persons on the panel. So we will be making those changes in due course. But what I'm sharing with you now is currently in the current version of the code. Next slide. So you have some responsibilities. If you are appointed as a panelist, you will need to sign and commit to an agreement, a confidentiality and conflict of interest agreement. Michael will make sure that you do not have any conflict of interest in terms of the parties that are involved in the complaint. You need to read and understand the complaint and also any documentation that comes with that complaint. Because bear in mind that Michael, as the independent chair, may have asked the respondent to provide a response to the allegation, and there might be some backwards and forwards, and there may have been some documentation that has arisen since the beginning of the actual logging of the complaint. So sometimes the ethics panel might get involved up front, they might get involved further down the line. And you need to make sure that you have read that the necessary documentation. You need to review the evidence that's provided. You need to also make sure that you are aware of the specific clauses in the code that the alleged transgression relates to, and use the latest version. The code does change, but the latest version is always that version on the SAMED website. And you need to respond within the afforded time. Okay. Remember that you are dealing with such important matters, and so you need to give your all when you are on the ethics panel, because if you don't adjudicate correctly, you stand the chance of ruining a company's reputation. That's what's at stake, and reputations can sink a company. Next slide. Just in terms of legalities, I have already mentioned this. Just a reminder, the ethics panel may not enforce regulations or law. That task is the responsibility of the relevant regulator, and the ethics panel is only there to enforce the code, but with knowledge of relevant regulations and laws. And there have been cases where, in fact, Michael has said, this is not within our jurisdiction. This is a matter for SAPRA, or this is a matter for the Hawks or other, and we have passed on those cases to relevant authorities. Next slide. Just in terms of sanctions, both the independent chair and the ethics panel have the power to issue a sanction that is appropriate. And there are various factors that one must consider when determining a sanction. One, the nature and extent of the breach, including its impact on the market and the reputation of the industry overall, not just the reputation of the company, but the entire industry. Whether the breach should have been evident to the company, the period of time over which the breach took place. Was it once off? Was it continued? The number and type of alleged breaches. So is this the first time, or is it the second time? Is it the third time? Impact of the breach on competitors, on patients, on healthcare providers, and or the provision of healthcare services. The respondent's failure to implement previously imposed sanctions and or undertakings if there was a previous case, and potential costs that would be incurred by a company in order to take corrective action. Next slide. What we have done is in the code, in part 2, there is a section which provides guidance on the possible types of sanctions that might be applied. It classifies them into minor, moderate, serious, and severe. It gives a definition, some potential corrective action for consideration. If a monetary fine is appropriate in this instance, it gives some guidance there, as well as the timelines within which the corrective action or the fine needs to be paid. Next slide. I'm not going to go through all of these, but just so you know that there is this guidance for panelists. Next slide. Also, in terms of appeal, the enforcement process does allow for parties to appeal the findings of either the independent chair, if it was done on his or her own, or the ethics panel ruling. And in that instance, the board will then appoint another independent chairperson to hear the appeal, and that independent chairperson has the power to also call an ethics panel if they feel the need to hear the appeal. In terms of costs, just please be aware that SAMED doesn't pay you for your services as an ethics panelist. So all costs in relation to whether it's travel or time is unfortunately for your company to cover. And we're very grateful that you are prepared to do this free of charge. It's not a insignificant amount of time that panelists spend. So please be aware that if you've put your hand up, that there is a responsibility to make yourself available and to spend time on a case. Next slide. And just to let you know that there are a number of code resources and support material for you on the website that you are welcome to also access. Please, if you've not done the code certification test, it is a requirement and expectation of ethics panelists to do so, and obviously to pass, even if you're not necessarily a customer-facing individual. Over to you, Michael.
Right, thank you very much, Tan. I listened intently. Excuse me, and always pick up little things and nuances that we didn't know, so thank you for that. No doubt Michelle will be in my office just now to lecture me on those that we've just learned. So let me go through my slides now. Why the need for an ethics panel? In King 4, which is the latest iteration of South Africa's corporate governance code, internationally regarded and respected, when we wrote that code, Principle 1 of good governance deals with ethics. And so it's fundamentally important that all of members of the ethics panel act in an ethical, effective, honest, transparent manner. We live in a world where you can't know everything. We live in a world where one should not be ashamed to say, I don't know, I don't understand, and ask questions. Because it's critically important as part of being ethical to be properly informed and never to be conflicted. So please, we ask of you, given, as Tanya said, the enormous weight which is on your shoulders when you make a finding, which could adversely affect a 50, 60-year-old company, tens of thousands of employees around the world, products which people use, could all be adversely impacted and affected by your decision. So please bear in mind this huge obligation, and please make sure that you're properly informed, that there is no conflict, that you absolutely understand what you're being asked to opine on, and never, ever, ever to be ashamed to ask a question before sitting and making the decision. And just finally, the seriousness with which you should approach this. So it's not a last minute thing when one gets home after a lot of food and a lot of alcohol before hearing the next day. That's dishonest to the people in whose lives will be determined by you the next day. And most of all, it's dishonest to yourself. Please make time to read the papers, to understand the papers, to be fully prepared, and to go into that panel meeting fully aware of this huge obligation on your shoulders. Take it seriously, please, for yourself and for those whose futures you're going to determine by your finding. Thanks, Tan. Very, very important for anybody who sits in an adjudicatory role, as you will when you sit on this, is to understand the principles of natural justice. I'm indebted to Caroline. Thank you, Caroline, for the wonderful slides and for the wonderful work you did on this slide particularly, but not exclusively. Thank you for all your help. In South Africa, we have two branches of the law. We have the statutory law, those are the acts of parliament, of the provinces, of municipalities. And then we have the common law, which is the law which started all those years ago in Rome with the 12 tablets, and the development of the common law in South Africa. Our common law is Roman Dutch based. Roman because all Romans are the root of all common law systems. Ours influenced by the English when we were occupied, by the Dutch when we were occupied, and the judgments of the High Court. And in that body of common law, these principles of natural justice have developed. These are principles which find their way into every statute, and the Constitutional Court take them all into account in every judgment which they make. The right to be heard. Everybody has the right to be heard. You need to listen to the people before you. You need to exercise judgment when they've said too much, and you need to help them when they've said too little. They have the right to be heard. The next is confidentiality. You can't, the next day over coffee, say to someone, I just want to tell you in confidence, you should hear what happened to X company. There are two very good sayings on confidentiality. The one is something which I learned from a Greek friend of mine, beware thy friend has a friend. And the other, which I heard from one of my very close Muslim friends, who said, the fish that doesn't open its mouth never gets caught. Please understand the importance of confidentiality. When you walk in and what you hear, and then when you walk out, everything, it happens in Vegas, and it stays in Vegas. And there's no good friend to share it with, because that friend shares it with another friend. The other is bias. We're all human beings. Many of you will have read Malcolm Gladwell's wonderful book, Blink, that blink moment. We go to a cocktail party, you're introduced, and in that blink moment, as you say hello, it's the way we wired. We decide who we like, who we don't, who we want to talk to. All kinds of things play into that bias. The appearance, the kind of appearance we want in people, the way they say things, and we are biased. It's very important. You may not like one of the parties in front of you, but if you are biased and you can't be objective, then be honest unto yourself and the others and remove yourself from the panel. You cannot be biased towards anyone because of their race, religion, color, creed, because they're short or fat or tall or thin, or they're some stereotype that you don't like. You can't be biased. If you are, you don't have to give the explanation why. Just say, I feel I'm conflicted in this matter, and let one of your fellow panelists hear it. Conflict of interest. The minute you rationalize for yourself whether you have a conflict or not, you are conflicted. So if you've bought a product from one of the companies, and you say, well, it was years ago and I'm over it, you're not over it. You conflicted. If there's anything which conflicts, if they're a competitor, if they refused you a job, if they've been unkind to somebody you know, whatever could create conflict in your mind, please withdraw and let somebody else hear it. The second is the evidence. Weigh carefully the evidence. Ask questions about the evidence. Make sure that you fully understand the evidence that's given. Ask questions to supplement the evidence where there are gaps for you. Read the evidence very, very carefully. And always remember in life that it's often what's not said which is most important. So read the evidence, think about the evidence, and apply all of the good thought process to that evidence. Fairness. Be fair. Be gentle. Be understanding. And treat everybody the same. South Africa's constitution makes it incumbent upon us that all people need to be treated equally and fairly. Be fair to both parties. Always be fair to all of the parties. Ask yourself the question, when I go to sleep at night tonight, can I, in that moment of absolute truth, when above all else unto thine own self be true, can I say, I was fair to everybody? And finally, consistency. You can't be up and down. You can't be one moment doing one thing, next moment doing another. You have to walk into the hearing, be consistent. Consistent in listening, consistent with your confidentiality, consistent with no bias. It needs to be an ocean without waves or ripples. Just make sure that everything you do is consistent with what you've done before and what you're going to go in the future. This, my friends, is the most difficult and most important of the slides. This is, before you walk in, what you promise yourself. And that's the biggest promise of all, that you will apply. Very important to understand is the difference between regulation and self-regulation. The regulation is where you regulate it by statute. So drafts people write legislation, and the courts or a regulator enforce it. Remember that this is the critical difference. These are people who don't understand what they're writing about. They're just lawyers who understand the law. So when they write an act dealing with road traffic, they're not road traffic experts. They're lawyers, and they write laws for the road. In self-regulation, which is why self-regulation is gaining such momentum around the world, you regulate it by your peers, people who understand. So when I come before the ethics panel, I must have confidence to know that deciding my fate are people who are of this industry, who understand this industry. And self-regulation is where a body like SAMED, experts in the field of medical devices and all that goes with it, regulate people within the field in terms of their constitution. They don't have regulatory power. They can't send you to jail or fire or impose any other kind of sanction that a court can, but they can refer it to a regulator to do that. Their power is only to be found in the Constitution, and it's becoming a very big thing, self-regulation. So you will know that advertising in this country is self-regulated, and I was involved in that fight a few years ago where they fought in Parliament not to be regulated by people who have no idea of what advertising is about, but to self-regulate. And it's on your shoulders whether self-regulation will continue or not. Because if you make bad judgments, it's fodder for government to come in and say, you clearly can't self-regulate, so we're going to write a statute which will regulate it. So remember the importance for this self-regulation and all the self-regulation that follows, the importance when you self-regulate of how important it is to apply all of these principles so that we have an argument when government wants to regulate the industry to say no, because look how well we regulate it ourselves. Next slide. Right, Tan, over to you as the moderator to deal with the questions.
Great. So we have 45 minutes dedicated just for questions. So please, if you've never been on a panel of this kind before, if you have any questions, raise your hand, feel free to ask. So over to you.
And just let me say at this point, please, no embarrassment about asking the questions. Don't analyze in your mind if it's silly or not. Because if in the meeting when the taxi industry met, there hadn't been some silly person who came up with some silly idea, we wouldn't have Uber or self-riding today. If some silly person in an accommodation meeting hadn't asked a silly question, we wouldn't have Airbnb. So some of the greatest ideas have come from what could be termed silly questions, and we need to learn from you today. So please ask all the questions.
Rob, go ahead.
Thank you, and thanks to Tanya and Michael for the presentation. Much appreciated. I'm not sure if it's a question, a statement, or a kind of throwing a thought out there, but I just need to ask, do we, or will we, or should we? You can understand that I'm maybe a little bit confused, comes with age. Should we be having some form of selection criteria in place, sort of a baseline criteria in terms of the selection of panelists? And I'm asking this question without being disparaging to any individual who may be on this discussion, or any individual who may want to become a panelist into the future. It's not as though we have a plethora of people that are knocking at the door wanting to be panelists. We've struggled for since time immemorial to get high quality, call them qualified panelists, if you will. And I just would like an opinion, probably from you, Michael, in terms of, should we have some sort of baseline requirements in terms of the selection of panelists, and if so, then Tanya, it would behove us as SAMED, or you as SAMED, to put those baseline requirements into place in terms of selecting stroke appointing panelists. Thank you.
Rob, I don't want to sound patronizing. I respect you too much to do that, but it's a brilliant question. We as SAMED would be failing in our duty if we just appointed a panelist without careful consideration of who the person is. And we have touched on it in discussions with Tanya about an application with 2 or 3 referees, and putting forward why this person believes that they would be a good panelist, and 2 or 3 people who know them professionally and personally, people that we could regard and respect, just to support it and tell us a little about it. So that goes hand in hand. If we think back since what we've just gone through this morning, of the importance and the impact of the decisions, it most certainly behoves the SAMED board that there is a criteria for selection of the panelists. So this is not just a fabulous CV item to say that I'm on the ethics panel of SAMED, because it's very prestigious. It needs only to go to people who meet the criteria. So yes, Rob, that needs to be done. I say that with respect. It's not me who makes the decision. It's Tanya and the SAMED board. I would strongly recommend it.
Thanks, Michael. And you know, just to reinforce, I've been, you know, had the good fortune to be a panelist and on appeal committees, etc. historically. And to your point, it is extremely important that one applies their minds in dealing with the cases, because you are dealing, at times you're dealing with multi-million multinationals who may suffer reputational damage, etc., etc. So it's not something to be taken lightly, and it's certainly critical that as a panelist one comes on board with the necessary baseline requirements in terms of qualification. Thank you very much.
Rob, thanks for supporting that. I've had the pleasure and the privilege of sitting with you on an appeal. You came fully prepared. You'd worked really hard on it. You made some wonderful suggestions to Michelle and I, many of whom we were given effect to in the judgment. So you can talk with conviction and certainty, because you took this role very seriously, and I'm sure the panelists would want to maybe direct a question or two to you, because you've walked this talk and you know all that we've said is correct. So certainly, with Tanya's permission, I would have no objection to a panelist directing a question to you, given your experience of being on the panel and contributing greatly. So yeah, they most definitely need to be people who have the qualifications, but I'll leave that in Tanya's competent hands to decide how that's done.
Thanks, Michael. Yolanda?
Thanks, Tanya. I think from my side, more a comment, and possibly to just support exactly what Rob has just raised, and everything else that Michael has also added on. possibly just a suggestion. You have obviously shared in your presentation what the requirements from each panelists would be, but then maybe perhaps from a SAMED website perspective, if ongoing tests, maybe just as a baseline as well, each panelist could take a test or submit an application, and then the tests that they write, so that SAMED is then able to adequately assess whether the panelists that may be sitting in the call, meet those requirements that would ensure that the SAMED panelists, uphold the integrity and inspire the confidence and also possess all of the expertise that are required to be ethical panelists. And maybe panel sessions every once and again, like Michael has said, that Rob has walked this journey, lunch and learn sessions that SAMED could look to having, so that each panelist then has possibly the opportunity to learn from other panel members that have walked this journey and are experts in being those panelists. So just a comment really from my side. Thanks.
Thanks, Yolanda. Great ideas.
Can I ask you just to deal with the next question and give me a moment? I just need to quickly go and sign something.
Sure.
Just deal with the next question.
Will do. Ian, over to you.
Yes, good morning. Thank you. I'd just like to find out, just from when we talk about potential reputational damage that can arise out of these panels and judgments, what protection does a panelist have? And are they potentially exposed to personal litigation or being sued on personal capacity should a company feel that the judgment has caused significant damage to their organization as a direct result of a panelist?
Okay, so I don't know if Michelle wants to maybe speak to that, but what SAMED does have is we have liability, we have professional indemnity and liability insurance. So should something like that occur, it would be covered by that insurance. We list all our committee members as well as our board and our panelists with our insurer. So they would be covered in terms of that.
Thank you.
Michelle, do you want to talk to that?
So essentially, in regards to all the matters that we've currently had, only the parties, the complainant and the respondent, have been the party to each of the matters. The board is given a summary and overview of what the matter was about, but the board does not actually know who the parties were in that specific matter. The matter is only, Tanya would be the only other person that knows besides Mr. Juden and I, and then the parties themselves. We would draft all our documents in and not referencing them specifically. We would also then, if the matter is referred to an appeal, only the appeal chairperson would know who the parties are. The only time when the matter is out there and people can talk about it and say who the parties were and what happened in that matter is if they actually physically take the matter to a High Court of South Africa, because then it becomes a public document, whereas right now all documents are confidential. The matter is held confidentially. No matter, it's not, no parties' names are included in any of the correspondence between ourselves and the board and any of the parties. Everybody is sort of redacted in any of the correspondence.
Michelle, can I just ask a question in terms of the ethics panelists? If you call an ethics panel, do they know the names of the parties, or do you keep that confidential as well?
They would have to know the names of the parties, but everybody that is participating would be signing a confidentiality agreement, because that information cannot leave, because it's not a public document. It's not a public hearing. Everything is internal. It's in-house. So there'll be everybody knows that it's a confidential hearing, and all matters is dealt with confidentially. Sorry.
And in terms of Ian's query, would the parties know who the ethics panelists are?
Yes, they would know who the ethics panelists are. They would also get a judgment from the ethics panel, but that judgment is only made available directly to the parties themselves. It is not even made public to the board or SAMED themselves, or a redacted version would be made available should they require it.
Great. Vitor? Ian, does that answer your question? Sorry, Vitor. Ian, does that answer your question sufficiently?
Yes, thank you.
Morning all, and it's always great to participate in these things, because I do believe that it's fundamental that our code committee be respected and upheld. So I do appreciate your time, Mike and Michelle and Tanya. My question is, and maybe Tanya can answer, and therefore then I'll continue with it. Currently for SAMED, how many members sit in a panel, an ethics panel?
So at the moment, well, we have a pool of ethics panelists that we can draw from, which is really this, we've asked the people who are joining us today to be on that pool. But the code currently says that 2 persons can be appointed by the independent chair to sit on an ethics panel. Michael and I have chatted about this. We don't think that that's really the best number, because if, they are divided in their opinion, it can, create difficulty getting to a decision. So we are going to be reviewing that. And I've actually asked Michelle just to take a good, long, hard look at the current part 2, and let's see how we can just improve on it.
That is great, Tanya, because my point was on that. As you know, I was part of other panelists in an ethics committee in previous societies, and I always felt that a number 3 or a 5 is always better, because if there's a stalemate, you're able not to hold back the sort of outcomes. You can always go in a vote, and that even happens in big courts of laws, where you can see the judges will all sort of vote in, and there's never a stalemate, because there's always a number that can break that. So that's was my concern, and I fully agree with Rob's comment and uphold it as well, and I'm here to support the code. Thank you very much.
And also you want the independent chair to have more leeway, because if the case is a really complex case, and you need a particular person with a particular skill, you may actually need to have more than 3 or 4, because you want someone who is very well versed in that. Maybe it's about a particular type of product, for example, or a particular way of advertising, and so you actually need someone maybe who is very well versed in that area to come and sit on an ethics panel.
Excellent, and I fully agree with that, and that's why I'd say instead of a 4, make it a 5, so that there's never stalemate.
That's why, is it correctly pronounced, Vitor?
Correct.
Italian?
No, Portuguese.
Portuguese. Now, very close to my heart. My mother and father, my father was fluent in Portuguese, and they were married in the old Lorenzo Marx.
So I was born there.
We'll check later if we related.
Okay.
The Vitor makes a very important point. Definitely it should be 3. That's why there's never an even number that sits in an appeal court, as Vitor has already correctly enunciated. And you, Tanya, make an excellent point. It goes to my point on the slides. We live in such a complex knowledge world, and it's becoming more and more frequent for the courts to bring in an expert in a particular field to give evidence and assist. So you're absolutely right. Where there's a very complicated matter, particularly if it's a digital issue, something in artificial intelligence, something like that, where you would need to bring in an expert from possibly not a panel member, but an expert in the field to sit on that panel and assist. So, and particularly as we go into the world of artificial intelligence and machine learning, etc., which is all going to play such a huge role in the medical device world, we may find ourselves often going to those type of experts.
Great. Any more questions? Michael and I were hoping that we would be inundated.
If I may, Tanya, just a quick one. Do the members of the ethics panelist have to be a SAMED member, or can you actually have some people that do want to offer their services free of cost, and maybe they've got legal experiences or other things like that?
So, good point. The code does not prescribe that it has to be from a SAMED member. Yeah.
Great.
It just says suitably qualified. So if I just, I've actually got the code open because I'm making some amendments to it as we speak. But it actually says it says persons from SAMED's list of suitably qualified experts. So that's who would comprise the ethics panel.
Yeah, and I comes back to Rob's point, just to give comfort to everybody on the call, is I think this process of selecting somebody, proper applications, proper supporting documents from referees, proper consideration of before the person is given this huge task becomes very important, given the huge obligations on the shoulders of that person and the importance of that person's judgment and decision. So it all comes nicely together. We're very mindful of the importance of these ethics panel members. Very. I think we got a question.
We do. Shamima, go ahead.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for this really awesome session. Mine is a bit more of a logistics question, and it's relevant really to the commitment that we make in adjudicating and reviewing cases. Just, is there any guidance on lead time? So for example, many of us work and we travel, and we'd like to, I mean, for me especially, I'd like to be able to commit fully when I am appointed or if I'm appointed. So just lead times and how to manage that kind of logistics so that the commitment is where it needs to be.
Can I deal with that, Tan?
Yes.
That's okay. Well, you're going to have a star put next to your name, because that's exactly the kind of person we want to sit as an ethics panel. Somebody to whom commitment and giving sufficient time is important. So thank you so much for that question, and it's wonderful guidance for all of us on this call. So yes, it's very important that you've given sufficient time to prepare, that you've given sufficient time to read your pack and do your research. And given that we're gratefully coming out of a COVID world, we had to meet virtually during COVID, but we can now meet and connect when we are together face to face. So very important is for the ethics committees to be face-to-face meetings with people able to communicate, the panelists to be able to not only meet, but to connect with each other before making the decision. So yes, plenty of time to prepare, advance notice of it. And that, for busy people, brings me why I was asked Tanya if I could respond to this. Because, man proposes and the Lord disposes. So we have a look at a calendar, and November's perfect, and we commit for 2 days. And then there's an important travel. which you have to do for the company. We can't be told a day before, I'm sorry, I can't appear because I've got to go for my company to Cape Town. If illness intervenes, a hospital stay intervenes, that of course, there'll always be somebody on standby. But if you commit, it really needs to be a commitment to that date. We can't control illness, but otherwise a real commitment to that date from your side, and from SAMED's side, an absolute commitment to give you enough time to prepare, to do your research, to ask your questions, to talk to Tanya, and to be ready for the hearing. Tanya, have I missed anything?
No, I think maybe also just to say that the independent chair is the is kind of the overseer. And so, the independent chair, and as you can hear, Michael is someone who understands the nuances and the requirements of, working in a company. And certainly, I don't believe that Michael or Michelle would implement impractical deadlines for ethics panelists to come back with responses. So they would certainly bear that in mind.
Thanks. That's perfect. I appreciate it.
Kathy?
Hi. So just to follow on from Shamima's question, so we can't really anticipate any emergency situation, but if at the time, if one is selected and you are aware of, travel commitments or huge projects at work that would not allow you to give the required commitment, does the option exist to decline and ask it to be sent to somebody that can at the time give the necessary commitment?
Okay, so if I can come in there, because if an ethics panelist is self-employed, this obviously wouldn't apply. But if the ethics panelist works for a company, we would need, as part of the application process, a commitment from the company that they support the ethics panelist, so that if something urgent happened in the company, whoever it was, the CEO, the FD, would say, no, Kathy, we've supported Kathy as an ethics panelist. She's got a hearing that day. She's prepared for that hearing. We need to either postpone what we're doing or ask somebody else to do it. So it needs the commitment from the employing company that, yes, we're going to support Kathy as a panelist and won't throw something at her the day before. Because just have a look at what's gone into that day. The parties have engaged lawyers and advocates. They may well have their legal counsel if they're a subsidiary of an international group. We had one where I think the legal counsel flew into South Africa to consult with the parties. The parties have prepared. Tanya's office have done a huge amount the preparing of the packs. Lots of people have given a commitment and have ruled through their diary. It's just not fair the morning before to say, oh, my boss says I must go to Durban tomorrow. So we need the commitment from the company which says, I'm aware that Kathy's a panelist and the company will support her on a date that she's done it. Illness, that's not in our hands. If somebody's sick, there would always be somebody on standby. But it can't just be, oh, I'm sorry, I have to go to Durban, or obviously. I mean, there are life throws curveballs. There's funerals, there's illness, those sort of things. Of course, we understand. But the company, I'm repeating myself, the company has to be committed to supporting the person that's standing, and that it will only be a very serious issue that would require them. Because the person standing in could now have a morning or an evening to get ready for this very important matter. So this is a serious thing. Before applying to become a panelist, these are all things that need to be considered.
And if I can add to that, Michael, you know, if you are chosen, most likely you would be chosen because of your very specific skills or experience. So, you know, a lot of thought would have gone into why you particularly would have been chosen to manage this particular case. And those experience and skills are not easily maybe found in just another person on the panel. And we also have to be very cognizant, you know, Michael spoke about the principles of natural justice. We need to also think about fairness. We need to think about this case could be, it could actually be something in relation to patients. You know, maybe the matter could, if it is not dealt with speedily, for example, could cause greater damage down the line, and maybe even affect patient safety, for example. So, so I think, you know, absolutely, where there are instances where they are completely beyond our control, yes, we will, you know, try to find another panelist. But I think if you are chosen to really, you know, try and put aside other activities that and to allow yourself the time to really give of yourself to that particular case. Rob?
Yeah, I think it's also important to mention, you know, this is not a situation where the situation requires calling a panelist every other week to come and sit on adjudication processes and what have you. You know, I remain concerned that we have so few cases that are coming through the whistleblowing process, etc. And the jury's still out in my mind as to whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, because I still believe that many of our members are reluctant to come forward on some matters for fear of victimization. But we don't have dozens and dozens of cases every year. You know, we probably, in terms of requiring panelists, you know, historically, I don't think we've had more than 2 or 3 in any given year. So, you know, for those of you who are concerned that it may be, oh, I need to commit, you know, 2 weeks of a month every month, that's not the case, just to give you some assurance there. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Rob. Any other questions from anyone? There, Shamima.
Yeah, sorry, Karen. So my question is just a little bit different. I was just interested in understanding in your experience. So you mentioned that many of the members are more distributors than, you know, direct selling companies. What have you, in your experience, what has been their interpretation or their internalization of the concept of this patient being at the center of everything? Because the relationship is very much linked to the end user.
Well, I wouldn't think that there should be any difference between a multinational or a distributor or a wholesaler in terms of their, you know, where they put the patient. You know, the patient should really be at the heart of all that they do. I don't necessarily think that there should be a difference between a multinational versus a distributor in that regard. I don't know if anybody else wants to, or am I understanding your question correctly?
No, I think you're absolutely correct. I'm actually referring to when you've looked at and reviewed compliance programs, etc. What's your experience been? What have you found?
I think it's a good question, Tan, because if I'm understanding, it's actually quite a deep question, because somebody who's working with the patient, where the patient's real, is probably more sensitive to the patient issue than somebody who just makes it, packages it, and gives it to somebody, and
Yeah.
never sees the patient. And I think it's a deep question, because as human beings, we are influenced by what we see, which is why in a lot of charities, they like to bring the patrons and the donors to come and have a look at the institution and actually see the people. It plays a very important subliminal role in our minds.
Yeah.
When it's real. It's that whole question of abstract and actual, theoretical and practical. And it's a very deep and very good question. So, and I'm really pleased you've asked that question. It really works its way into the principles of natural justice.
Because I was asking it in relation to understand, you know, when you're adjudicating, you're trying to understand someone's intent, or you're trying to understand, you know, where did this all start for you when you embarked on whatever you embarked on? You know, what was at the center of that?
I really like the question. I find it very profound and deep and thought through. And certainly for me, I'm going to carry that question, because I think when choosing the panel, if you've got an end user issue, there should be somebody on that panel for whom it's not abstract, but they're real people, and work with them all the time. Maybe it's something we need to take into account when we're appointing a panel. Certainly going to weigh on, certainly a question I'm not going to forget.
Thanks for the feedback.
Thanks, Shamima. Annalene?
Good morning, everybody. Yeah, I think I've been listening quite intently, but I think I would like to maybe just reply to the last or respond to the last question. As a manufacturer distributor, working with a health professional being our end user, but not the patient, I think it is a misconception that we don't always do things with the patient in mind. But with medical devices or testing and having a direct impact on the outcome of patient treatment, we do carry, you know, that same dedication as to a device or a IVD company that actually has direct impact on a patient or direct contact. So I think it might be the experience of 20 years or 30 years, whatever, but I think it is also the might be misconstrued as, you know, if it's not just a drop box. Yes, you get suppliers or distributors that just delivers, but I think most distributors, manufacturers, because we import anyway more than 90% of devices into South Africa, the one thing working in the public sector, 90% of the customers of my company is or our company is the public sector, and making a difference in the rural primary healthcare is what motivates us. So not all distributors should be seen as box drop type of approaches. So I think that's really important to take in account. As a point of care company, over the years with SAMED's help, and we've worked very closely with SAMED for many, many years. From my experience, and not to be you know, negative about it, but I think that was why I jumped at the opportunity to join a panel like this, is that we found, and I specifically reaching out, found that there might be a lack of general understanding as to point of care versus home testing, and to differentiate between when it comes to the code or to legislation as to what is really seen as home testing and what is medical diagnostic or accurate medical diagnostic point of care testing. And I think that's a lot of the companies are, big device companies, works with the laboratories or hospitals or directly with a patient, but from a medical perspective, whereas with point of care, there's still a big confusion, even in the government as to how to differentiate. And if you can't differentiate between the products in point of care or home testing, then you also can't apply SAMED regulations or SAMED code or legislation, especially with promoting and advertising and things like that. So I think that's also something that's really important for us as a small point of care company in South Africa, but also a global company, is that having representative companies on a panel with the market experience or the experience as to, I'm not going to repeat myself, but you get the what I'm trying to say. I think that's really important.
I think
As
that
a
is so
diverse panel.
valuable. Annelie, that is so valuable because, and this Mike makes me think why our world, the medtech world, is very diverse and very complex. And there are so many stakeholders involved. It's not just an engagement between, a medtech company and a procurer. Whatever you do as a medtech company can potentially have an impact on various stakeholders. It impacts the health system overall. It impacts potentially the users, whether it's a nurse or a patient or a healthcare professional. It can impact the healthcare facility, the hospital. So it's really is a very non sort of homogeneous environment, and there are also different types of products with different business models and different marketing models that we need to be aware of and have. And so I think this is great because it's going to make me go back and think, even amongst the panelists that we have now, do we have sufficient types of sort of product types, and how do we make sure that we have what we need potentially?
Yeah, I didn't, I know Annelie wasn't criticizing, but I didn't understand the question before Annelie's as disparaging people and just saying they drop boxes. I think the previous question, which I still think is very profound, highlighted a very important point for us and has set in motion a whole lot of other stuff, including the learning from Annelie, of issues that must be taken into account when appointing panel members. And it comes all back to Rob's point about the scrutinizing to see who to appoint. So we need to be able to see that these really are cradle to grave people, that they're people who understand all the way from the artificial intelligence that uses in creating the product, all the way to that patient in a hospital bed or at home that the device is assisting, and making sure that when we appoint a panel, that there is that sufficient diversity to understand it. And the previous question underlined the importance of taking into account in choosing panel members, something which perhaps we haven't done in the past. So when we listen to this recording, the last two questions are going to become very important in what SAMED must be told when selecting a panel member and what SAMED must take into account when selecting a particular panel. So we really did leave the best for last.
Rob.
Yeah, I think again, just a comment in terms of the latter discussion. If you're dealing with and it's an old expression in the market, box movers or actual people who are providing point of care, direct patient contact, etc. I think we must not lose sight of the overarching principle that the code tries to carry in terms of the patient, and that is, what is the best possible product or treatment or regimen, whatever the case might be, for the patient, irrespective of how it's delivered to the patient. If it's delivered directly through a company representative as a point of care entity, if it's via a healthcare professional, etc., the principles of the code still apply there. And I'm not trying to take any gravitas away from this latter discussion. I just need us to always understand and keep it in perspective that it is the clinical application, the clinical outcome, and in everything is in the best interest of the patient, no matter how it's delivered to that patient. Thanks.
Rob, you're absolutely right. When we were preparing for this, I mentioned something that I was going to say, and that is when when we were writing King 3 and we were working with the draftspeople of our current and new Companies Act, one of the important sections in the new Companies Act is that you directed in interpreting it not to look at the strict legal interpretation, but to always understand what was the intention. And so, like Bill Clinton had a sign on the wall in his office which said, "It's all about the economy, stupid." And when people came to the office to talk to him, he always pointed at that sign. For us, it's all about the patient and that device, and that must never be lost sight of. So you're absolutely right to end that with that, and that's what SAMED's all about. It's a caring organization, and we must never, ever, ever forget that it's all about the family of that person whose life can be changed positively by one of our members by acting ethically. And it's to those people that we must never, ever forget that we owe the obligation. And Michelle and I go into every matter bearing that in mind, that somewhere at the end of this chain is a human being whose life can be changed positively or adversely by the conduct of a SAMED member. This is a very important organization, and this is a very important panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike. So we're literally 1 minute away from 11:30, which is our end time. Sorry, if you could just put yourselves on mute, if you don't mind. So any last question from anyone? No. Okay. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you so much, Michael and Michelle. We've got some wonderful ideas that have come out of today. We're definitely going to see how we can implement them. And yeah, just thank you. Really appreciate it. And thank you to all of those who are willing to be on this panel. Yeah, really appreciate it. Go well.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you for your time.
Thank
Enjoy the
you.
rest of your day. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.